Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sandra Morgan, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's panel discussion, the second in our series on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, history, politics, and global security. Today's conversation will focus on military spending, arms control, and the possibility of nuclear, chemical, or cyber warfare. These conversations acknowledge the strength and diversity of scholarship at Kent State University. Our panelists are all experts in their respective fields and will provide us with a nuanced and insightful perspective on current global affairs and more. Before I turn the program over to our moderator, Dr. Molly Merryman, and to our discussants, I'd like to remind you that our microphones are muted, but not your voices. We look forward to an excellent conversation and your questions. After the panelists have spoken, Dr. Merryman will ask your questions of the panelists and provide plenty of time for response. You may ask questions of the panel in general or of an individual. If you'd like an individual to answer, please direct your question directly to that person. As a reminder, to ask a question, please select the Q&A tab that's on the ribbon at the bottom of your screen and type it there. You may also join the conversation in the chat section. Unfortunately, tonight we will not acknowledge raised hands, so please write your questions in one of the other, either the Q&A or in the chat. As always, we ask that your questions be courteous, productive, and on topic. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the evening's program moderator and my good friend, Dr. Molly Merryman, Associate Professor in the School of Peace and Conflict Studies. Molly, take it away.
Thank you, Sandra. And before I move into the program, I do want to take a moment to thank Sandra and many staff from the College of Arts and Sciences who have been wonderfully helpful at organizing last week's sessions as well as this week's session. And to the audience, I want to first respond to your questions from last week and to let you know that all of the presenters tonight have reviewed questions and will be answering as many as possible and orienting their conversations around key issues that you raised. And there are 2 points that I want to address that were brought up. One is that we were asked last week about what Kent State was doing to support students and scholars from the Ukraine. And obviously the invasion and refugee crises are still unfolding. So it's a challenge to implement structural changes when things are still in flux. But what is happening is that many of us who are faculty and staff scholars at Kent State University have international research communities and scholarly communities that we work through. And so we've been at an individual level working with those organizations to look at how we can best address the needs of our Ukraine colleagues and to see in terms of specific action, whether that's material support or symbolic support, what our organizations can be doing. And we'll be continuing to try to engage as much as possible to provide significant support to our scholarly community from Ukraine. Additionally, people have asked how they can help, how they can offer support to Ukrainian citizens and refugees. And I wanted to just bring up a couple of points of ways that you can take action. One is obviously to reach out to your elected officials and to encourage them to provide support and streamline processes for asylum seekers. Another is to donate to aid organizations. And I think people often get confused because there are a number of aid organizations out there. There are those long-term established international aid organizations such as Doctors Without Borders, the UN Refugee Association, Red Cross, Oxfam, and UNICEF, who are directly providing support to Ukraine. And there are organizations within Ukraine and also Poland who's accepting refugees that you can also donate to. And what I wanted to say is there's many organizations that support special populations or target special issues such as providing food, medicine, other kinds of material aid. And I think that what agencies you choose are reflected in your own personal choices and values. And that what I wanted to say is that, so long as you give, that's what matters. And there are many different ways to give. But I also wanted to alert you that there always, sadly, are scam artists that operate when there are times of need. So I wanted to provide you with a couple of just critical things to look for when you're deciding to make donations. And I think, one is to avoid crowdfunding and social media campaigns unless you're absolutely sure and can verify what the organization is. Second of all, you might want to look at agencies that are either established government agencies or verified nonprofit organizations that work directly with Ukraine or refugees, that have a history of work in this region and also in this field of humanitarian aid support. So, exercise due diligence, but definitely, there aren't any particular organizations that we advocate for. I do think that what matters is providing support in ways that fit your own ethics. And with no further ado, I would like to turn over to our panel. The order of presentations today is that we will start with Dr. Neil Cooper, followed up by Dr. Andrew Barnes, who's an associate professor from the School of Multidisciplinary and Social Sciences and Humanities, Dr. Eli Kaul from the Department of Political Science, Dr. Gabriella Paar-Jakli, associate professor from Political Science, and conclude with Dr. Richard Steigmann-Gall, an associate professor in the Department of History. I'm not going to provide biographies of everyone since this is a part 2, but I do want to tell you briefly about Dr. Neil Cooper, because he was the moderator last week and didn't obviously didn't introduce himself with that significant biographical support. So Professor Neil Cooper is the director of the School of Peace and Conflict Studies here at Kent State University. He has published over 50 books, edited books, and articles. His research has covered topics including the political economy of civil war, post-conflict peace building, arms control, and disarmament. Professor Cooper was formerly the editor of the referee journal International Peacekeeping and is currently an associate editor of the Economics of Peace and Security Journal. He's also a member of the editorial board of the journal Critical Studies on Security. He has a BA in Politics and Sociology from York University in the United Kingdom, an MA in International Relationships from the University of Kent in the United Kingdom, and a Ph.D. also from the University of Kent. And so with that introduction, Neil, I'd like to turn over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Molly. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen to bring up PowerPoint. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. All right. So I want to do 2 things very quickly. First of all, one is to, I think, try and contextualize the Ukraine conflict in the context of some broader trends in the metrics of peace and conflict that don't look particularly positive. And also, secondly, to kind of try and respond to, I think, one of those sets of questions about, why doesn't the US or NATO impose a no-fly zone? And very much related to that, the question around, what would World War III look like? So let me just, begin by, so what's the broader context in which the war in Ukraine is occurring? Well, the broader context is a very worrying one, and it has been for some time. And I think people like me have been kind of raising warning signals about some of these trends for quite some time now. So you can see here from this graphic, global military expenditure has been on the rise now for a couple of decades. And this is in real terms, rise between 1998 and 2019, global military expenditure, excluding Iraq for reasons that I won't bore you with, rose by 82% in real terms. So we're kind of like, you know, now at the levels of global military expenditure that we saw towards the back end of the Cold War, which is quite remarkable, really. And all that post-Cold War peace dividend has gone. In terms of where that money goes, the US accounts for by far and away the largest amount of spending on military expenditure. It accounts for 39% of global military expenditure, more than the next top 10 spenders on defense combined. You'll see here that China is next at 13% of global military expenditure. And one of the reasons why we've seen such a rise is because Chinese military expenditure has increased by 76% in real terms between 2011 and 20. So whilst we're focused on the questions of the US, Russia, Ukraine, issues to do with US, China, Taiwan, are certainly things that we should be definitely worried about. In terms of NATO, which is not on this graphic, NATO military expenditure combined with all the countries together, including the US, Canada, et cetera, amounted in 2020 to $1,103 billion, about 55% of global military expenditure. And you'll see here that Russia accounts for about 3.1% of global military expenditure. So I guess one of the answers to that question about what would World War III look like is that if it was remained at a conventional level and did not go nuclear, NATO significantly outspends and outguns Russia. Russian military expenditure is about 8% of US defense expenditure and about 5.5% of NATO expenditure. Those figures don't give a kind of a proper assessment of the kind of military divides between the different countries, because you have to take into account the fact that spending, you know, the cost of things in Russia is that much less. So on a kind of purchasing power parity basis, the money spent by Russia goes that much further. Similarly, we've seen kind of worrying trends in the international arms trade. You can see here this graphic tracks the volume of weapons transfer. So it's not a value, it's a kind of static volume. It's a measure. It's an approach to measuring the arms trade adopted by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. But it gives you some indication of trends in the kind of volume of arms sold. And you can see here, this goes from, you know, the 1950s onwards. Again, we see a kind of high point in the Cold War, followed by declines in the post-Cold War era. But from the early 2000s, we've now seen a kind of uptick again in the flow of arms around the world. Global arms transfers in the period 2014 to 18 were 52% higher than for the period 2000 to 2004. And the flow of arms to the Middle East increased by 87% between 2009 to 13 and 2014 to 18. Likewise, you see here a graphic showing the levels of armed conflict in the international system. And you can see here from this graphic, it goes from 1946, this one goes up to 2018. The most recent data for 2019 suggests that the overall number of all kinds of state-based armed conflicts, civil wars, interstate conflicts, internationalized conflicts, in 2019 was actually the highest recorded in the post-Second World War period. So we have seen very significant increases, at least in the volume of international conflicts over in recent years. And this was to kind of summarize that element of the presentation. This is a quote from the UN Secretary General's 2018 Agenda for Disarmament, where it was noted that global military spending and capabilities exceed those seen at any point since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it depicted a world characterized by unrestrained arms competition, where limits on major conventional forces have been left aside, where armed conflicts are more protracted, more lethal, and more prone to regional rivalries and external intervention. So whilst the conflict in Ukraine itself is worrying, not least because of the potential for World War III, which I'll come on to in a second, we've seen some kind of, that's occurring in the context of these broader worrying trends in the international system as well. The next thing that I want to do then is kind of move on to this question of what would World War III look like, and obviously the concern kind of around that, and the concern obviously driving this question about why not impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine, the concern driving NATO and the US is that doing that might result in nuclear warfare. And just to give you some kind of figures on the consequences of that, these are the casualty figures from Hiroshima, the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the case of Hiroshima, you can see the pre-raid population was 255,000, the number of dead, 66,000, the number of injured, 69,000, and something like 13 square kilometers of the city were burned completely. One of the points to note here, however, is that the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were essentially what we would now consider fairly small nuclear weapons. And I'll come on to the consequence of slightly bigger nuclear weapons in a second. The good news is that the kind of post-Cold War period saw a really significant decline in nuclear warhead inventories. So you can see at the height of the Cold War, there was something like 70,000 nuclear warheads, mostly possessed by the Soviets and the US. Post-Cold War, there was a whole series of arms control agreements that helped bring those down, but we're still at a level where the US and Russia possess over 90% of nuclear weapons in the international system. The US has about 5,800, Russia 6,375, of which you can see the US has about 1,750 deployed warheads, and the Russians about 1,570. So we still have a large number of nuclear weapons in the international system. What would be the effect of those nuclear weapons? Well, one kind of big picture way of describing this comes from the opinion of the International Court of Justice in 1996. The International Court of Justice was asked to look at the legality in terms of the laws of war of using nuclear weapons. And the court actually kind of punted on that decision. It sort of fudged its conclusion. But I think this reference here from the court is worth describing. It kind of chills me every time I read it. The court kind of noted that the destructive power of nuclear weapons cannot be contained in either space or time. They have the potential to destroy the entire ecosystem of the planet. The radiation released by a nuclear explosion would affect health, agriculture, natural resources, and demography over a wide area. Further, the use of nuclear weapons would be a serious danger to future generations. Ionizing radiation has the potential to damage the future environment, food and marine ecosystems, and to cause genetic defects and illness in future generations. However, I kind of find that it's such big picture that I think it's very hard to comprehend. So I thought the kind of final thing that I would leave you with is in 1979, the US Office of Technology Assessment did a study on the effects of nuclear war. And one of the studies that they did is they did a study of the effect of one 1 megaton nuclear explosion on the center of Detroit, right? So this is just the effects of one nuclear explosion going off in the middle of Detroit. And they concluded that an explosion on the surface would leave a crater 1,000 feet in diameter and 200 feet deep. Up to 0.6 miles from the epicenter, there would be nothing recognizable remaining. Up to 1.7 miles, there would be virtually no survivors. And they estimated that would mean anything between 70 and 150,000 people being killed, depending whether the attack took place at night when most people, many people would have kind of like gone back to the suburbs, or whether it was during the day when all the working people were present. They also noted that it should be noted that the people here would essentially be killed by the blast, but if by some miracle anybody survived the blast, at the rate at the kind of up to 1.7 miles, it would also be the case that the levels of nuclear radiation would be lethal for unprotected people. As you can see, up to between 1.7 and 2.7 miles, individual residences would be destroyed and only the foundations and basements would remain. And of the 250,000 people in this area, there would be 130,000 fatalities and 100,000 injured. Between 2.7 and 4.7 miles, there would be only, I'm using the language of the Office of Technology Assessment here, there would be only 5% of the population in this area killed, but almost half, which they estimated at 180,000, with injuries, and fires would be likely to destroy buildings. Between 4.7 and 7.4 miles, 25% of the people in this area will be injured, and with what they estimated would be anything up to 75,000 burn injuries that would require specialized medical care that would be pretty thin on the ground, given that many of the hospitals themselves would have been destroyed along with their medical staff. Second degree burns would be experienced up to 6 miles away, and the collapse of buildings and the electromagnetic pulse from the explosion of the bomb would have caused immediate loss of power. They concluded by noting that this was a study based on the explosion of a 1 megaton bomb. They concluded by noting that a larger 25 megaton weapon would result in significantly higher deaths and casualties. So I think that's a useful way to just kind of concretize that discussion about, World War III. This is the kind of thing that it would actually mean in practice. There's other studies you can see here. One of the most recent ones looked at the effect of a Russian nuclear retaliation using 145 nuclear warheads, and it estimated that 30% of the population of the top 145 US cities would perish, including 1.8 million in New York. So when the likes of Biden and other leaders and the officials in NATO, talk about and consider the risks of a no-fly zone and the risks that might lead to World War III, or the potential that we might get there through some other route. These are the kind of figures and the metrics that they will have in mind when they're considering those factors. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Sobering, but very important data. And next up, I would like to introduce Dr. Andrew Barnes, who is an associate professor from our School of Multidisciplinary Social Sciences and Humanities. Andrew.
Thank you. And I almost did not unmute there. That's a risk of this format. Sorry. Thank you. I really appreciate, I'd just like to start by saying the effort that Arts and Sciences has put into putting together this follow-up event, as well as the first one. And I'm especially grateful to everybody who's attending today for your continued interest in this crucial issue. It's obviously hard to speak after what Neil just said, but one thing to keep in mind is that part of why we do continue to talk and explore options is in hopes of avoiding that, right? Whether by ending the war directly or by making sure whatever conflict continues doesn't go nuclear, right? So there are stages between where we are now and what we're talking about with nuclear weapons. My remarks are basically going to take the form of asking where things stand after another week of war, basically since the last time we met. And there'll be 4 short parts to what I say. First, I'll start with an observation about the cause of the war and what that would mean for a solution, or could mean for a solution. Second, I'll say a little bit about the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Third, I'll have some notes on the ongoing reaction from the West and the rest of the world. And then finally, a little bit about what we know about what's happening inside Russia. So as far as my opening observation, I'll start actually where I started last week, which is to highlight that everything I talk about here is all caused by the Russian invasion, which again was an unprovoked war of choice. Not to say that there's not tension in the world, but the war itself was a choice that didn't have to be made. This isn't an effort of last resort. There was no imminent threat to Russia from Ukraine or from NATO. And there was no humanitarian crisis that needed to be fixed. Indeed, it's causing one, or maybe multiple humanitarian crises. So following up on some of the questions from the chat last time, whatever sins that NATO, the West, the EU, the United States, or others have committed, and surely there have been many, that's not what caused this war. First, as I just said, none of those groups posed an imminent threat to Russia. But on top of that, attempts to join the EU and NATO, which I should point out are 2 different things, although Putin often conflates them. But those attempts have been driven by the Ukrainian side, not by the Western side. If anything, the West has slow-walked the expansion of NATO. Georgia, for example, was not just about to join NATO when Russia attacked Georgia in 2008. And Ukraine wasn't just about to join NATO when Russia attacked it in 2014 or 2 weeks ago. Putin sees Ukraine as not a separate entity from Russia, right? That they're naturally with Russia, but with its mind somehow messed up by the West, whoever that is. But most Ukrainians, probably essentially all of them at this point, would not agree with that, right? That is to take him at his word. Putin has gone to war because the other side doesn't understand that they belong to him. And that's not necessarily, that's not a point that I find convincing, right? So this means, I think, and more importantly, than the fact that I don't find it convincing, neither do the Ukrainians find it convincing. But that means that the solution to the war is almost certainly a Russian withdrawal and restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty. At least in the short term, it's hard for me to imagine Ukrainians accepting anything less than that. So there's no sort of stable splitting the country in half, or Russia occupies all the area outside of Kiev or something like that. It's either a withdrawal or a continuation of the conflict. And so the question is how to achieve that at the lowest possible cost. And the answer to that is not obvious, although they may depend partly on the rest of what I'm going to say. So where do things stand after another week of war? In Ukraine, Russia is encircling cities and laying siege to them. It still seems like they're not able to take them quickly, although I always fear that that's about to change. Their slow progress, relatively slow progress on the ground so far might be a combination of Ukrainian resistance, poor logistical planning and execution, and possibly some reluctance on the ground on the Russian side. But it's, again, unclear how long that can hold up. On the Ukrainian military side, they are continuing to inflict damage on Russian forces and to repel attacks on cities or retake small areas that the Russians have moved into. So it's an actual war on the ground rather than a rout. But again, how long they can hold on as an organized military force is definitely still a question. In terms of the civilian population in Ukraine, the number of refugees continues to climb, which is a crucial issue, and I'll get back to it in a second, but I also want to point out how many people remain in the country, right? Ukraine's population at the start of the invasion was around 44 million people. 2 million have left, which is enormous, with many more to follow, but that still means more than 40 million people still under fire. And as far as refugees go, the UN says that that 2 million number is more than in 3 years of civil war in Syria. And the war that we're talking about here is only 2 weeks old. Partly because of the rule that we talked about last time that men between the ages of 8 and 60 have to stay in the country. The refugees are predominantly women and children. Border countries are expanding their camps, right? Folks are trying to help. The EU, the US, the UK are all loosening restrictions on immigration and extending the right of Ukrainians to stay. It's not happening uniformly. It's not happening fast enough for some folks, but it's certainly ongoing. But the problem is enormous. Also, as you've probably seen, people of color who were in Ukraine to study or for any other reason are facing harassment and other obstacles as they try to leave, which adds just another layer to the tragedy. So that's in Ukraine. What's going on in the West in the last week? One thing that's happened is that sanctions have continued and have expanded. Most of you probably saw that the United States is banning the import of Russian oil and gas. You've also probably seen that we don't buy a lot of Russian oil and gas, so it's not maybe as big a deal as you would think, but it's something, and it certainly hits the Russian economy where it gains most of its revenues from. In addition, the UK is at least planning to end those imports by the end of this year. And maybe more importantly, this was an area that at the start was more or less left out of the sanctions. That is the area of oil and gas. So this is definitely a tightening of those sanctions, which is ongoing. And there are also talks about removing some Belarusian banks from SWIFT. In addition to government sanctions, individual companies are pulling out, probably not out of the goodness of their hearts, right? But they probably fear bad publicity. They fear that they'll have to leave on even worse terms if they wait, which is to say they might get nationalized if they stay. And at least some are trying to make a few bucks on the way out. Some of you may have seen the story about Shell over the weekend. But the removal of these companies, the departure of these companies is another damaging blow. And also in the West, military support continues and is increasing, right? There are anti-tank weapons, anti-aircraft weapons, drones, possibly planes someday, although that's been stalled a couple of times. Troops are continuing to move around Europe. Some troops are going from the US to Europe. So the things we talked about last week have continued and grown, right? Protecting NATO's eastern flank and shipping weapons into the conflict zone. So far, as Neil mentioned, there's been no-fly zone, even over the western part of the country. And that is because of fear of escalation and maybe accidental escalation. But on the other side is the fear that waiting for Putin to stop is just going to leave horrifying numbers of people dead. And so that is still on the table. Let me take about a minute and a half to say something about what's going on in Russia. It is clear that some folks in Russia are against the war. We've had more than 10,000 people arrested, which means that certainly there are many more who are opposed. Also, the government has seen fit to crack down further and further on dissent, which suggests that they fear dissent. At the same time, it's not clear how many are opposed to the invasion. Polls are unreliable, but they do show over 50% in support of the war, of which they're getting a sanitized version. But this was also true before the war. It's a pretty consistent number, the idea that Russia had the right to do something military in Ukraine. In addition, there are lots of stories of people in Ukraine calling the Russian relatives to tell them what's going on, and the Russian relatives not believing it. Instead, they're believing what's on TV, which is the idea this is a peacekeeping operation and it's all going to plan. So there is opposition, but it's extremely difficult and dangerous to try to do anything on the ground. So what's happened in the last week in the areas that I focused on is that the conflict has intensified. The Ukrainian military and civilians are still holding fast for the moment. The humanitarian crisis has intensified, and external pressure on Russia has increased, although the West has still avoided anything that looks like direct military confrontation with Russia. Any of that could change, frankly, before we're finished with this session, but that's where things are now as we continue to look for a way to force Russia to stop its attack. I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat. Folks asked in the conversation last time about sources for information. There's just a couple of places you could go, and you certainly don't have to, but thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barnes. And next up, we have Dr. Eli Kaul, who is from the Department of Political Science.
Thanks. I'm going to try and share my screen. I just have a few PowerPoint slides I'd like to share. So in the last panel, I covered a lot about what was going on the ground, but I wanted to start by addressing a question that I saw come up a lot, both in my classes, but also in the chat from the last panel. And that is about, is Putin behaving rational or not? And this is obviously a very difficult question to answer, not being in the mind of Putin. But a lot of his behavior and a lot of the actions he's taken have demonstrated an inhumane kind of approach to the sanctity of human life, particularly lives that are not his or those close to him. So to answer this question, I decided I was going to propose a couple possible answers that demonstrate how he is behaving rationally, at least from a tactical or a strategic perspective. And the first of which is based on his flawed worldview. As Dr. Barnes mentioned, there's this notion that Ukraine is part of Russia. And in his geopolitical mindset, he's seen the West, NATO, the United States, demonstrate weaknesses on the global stage, both in not acting against Russia in its incursions into South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia in 2008, nor its inhumane military actions in Syria, particularly when President Obama set the red line, not acting strongly following the use of chemical weapons against civilians, demonstrated a lack of resolve to Putin to adhere to what promises and pledges the West makes in terms of defending innocent civilians. And then the third one is the more recent withdrawal from Afghanistan. And all of these are not comprehensive, but they are examples of how Putin might be interpreting Western weakening in terms of geopolitical power. In terms of its military capabilities, President Putin has seen, and using military parades and demonstrations of Russian military might, evidence, at least from his perspective, that the Russian military is very strong. It has, and he sees the numbers and figures presented to him by his cabinet members that demonstrate this. And so he might have this perception that in terms of geopolitical balancing, the Russian military is on par with potential capabilities of, or at least the willingness of Western forces to engage in armed combat with Russian troops. And so there's this notion that he can provoke without drawing the West into a confrontation, particularly based on the nuclear question as well. And then, as Andrew mentioned, the Ukraine as part of Russia. This kind of action is demonstrative of someone who actually believes Ukraine is part of Russia, seeking to make Russia great again. And this notion of him behaving rationally just based on a flawed worldview exemplifies this. The other possible answer demonstrating his rationality in terms of the war in Ukraine would be that he's also behaving rationally based on flawed information from his subordinates. And this is also important because it provides him a likely cop-out were he to withdraw troops and be brought up on charges either in Russia or by the international community for committing war crimes. His cop-out would likely be to blame his subordinates, in particular, Sergei Shoigu, his military advisor, for the actions and for the failure to achieve the strategic goals. That leads me into what I wanted to talk about in terms of what's been going on in more detail since we've last spoke. But I'm going to cover it a little differently, where I'm just going to talk about some broad overall observations that one can make about what's going on in Ukraine since the war escalated on February 24th. So it's been mentioned before, but we are seeing a lot of evidence of demoralization of Russian units on the ground in Ukraine. Many have been misled or uninformed as to their actual mission prior to the invasion. Many were unprepared to face the level of resistance they are currently meeting. And the supplies and logistics seem to have been based on the perception of a quick victory rather than a long protracted conflict that requires constant resupply. And we are seeing Russian soldiers breaking into grocery stores and other venues. And currently I've seen information about Russian soldiers in villages sleeping and using the resources of houses that have been abandoned by Ukrainians who have fled the conflict zone. And so the Russian troops on the ground are not getting a high level of support from their commanders and from the Russian Federation itself. This is demoralized and possibly provides a reason for the lack of quick success or the lack of military victories in many of the cities that Russia is currently trying to occupy. The strategic intelligence failures is where my research and interests focus on heavily. The Russian security services, the FSB, has a long-standing network of informants and saboteurs on the ground in Ukraine. Many observers of the conflict have noted this for several years. And the Ukrainian government has been taking actions to try and cut down on the number of foreign operators working within Ukraine's border. But nevertheless, they still exist and they're still on the ground. And there's dramatic new evidence coming out of just how vulnerable they've become. The Ukrainian security services have thwarted the encrypted communications network that FSB officers use to communicate with their operators on the ground in Ukraine. And so they're actually using open channels that are easily observed by Ukrainian security forces. And if you do a cursory search, you might be able to find a couple examples of them actually speaking to one another, and Ukrainian government officials are posting and disseminating. The Ukrainian counterintelligence service within the SBU, the Ukrainian security services, are receiving real-time tips from average citizens and taking quick actions. And they just recently posted a thank you to the citizens for their quick responses at identifying saboteurs and potential informants. And then the biggest reason why this intelligence operation and these intelligence networks are starting to crumble in Ukraine for the Russians is that the Russian operatives seem to have miscalculated how easily they stand out to Ukrainians. It's very easy for Ukrainians to challenge an individual that they don't know, a stranger, to determine whether or not they're a Russian operative or not. And many of the Russian operators working in Ukraine do not know Ukrainian. And these are two different languages. And so it's very interesting to hear stories of how just an average civilian spoke in Ukrainian to someone and they couldn't understand them or didn't respond properly to whatever was said. And they separate, and then that Ukrainian citizen writes to the SBU on the secure communications setup that the SBU has established and identifies them as a potential saboteur or informant. Thirdly, the failed militarization due to corruption. One of the points that I made about Putin's rationale is based on his interpretation of Russia's military might. One of the things that's starting to present it's starting to become very clear that the Russian military capabilities are not as highly it's not as highly capable as we thought they were, or as many people thought they were going into this war. And one of the reasons for this is very likely the creation of the power vertical that Putin used to establish his control over the political system in Russia enables his close associates and oligarchs and military elites and security service elites to siphon money from state projects. And many of these state projects are focused on redeveloping or reinvigorating the Russian military. And this has been the case since early in Putin's presidency. Following the Kursk submarine disaster, Putin became determined to revitalize and modernize Russia's military. And one of the things that has been very apparent in this conflict as things have moved on is that the Russian military capabilities, at least in fighting what it's perceived itself as its strategic advantage in a ground war, are not as strong as, at least initially not as strong as they might have perceived. That doesn't mean that the Russian attacks on the ground aren't going to get worse and more violent and more deadly. And we're starting to see more and more targeting of civilian installations and civilians in general. There's some very disturbing images coming out in the past few days of innocent civilians being not just collateral damage of a Russian attack, but actually targeted by Russian attacks. And so one of the reasons for this is likely the inclusion of less trained personnel, but also it could be a tactical decision to try and provoke President Zelensky to capitulate or engage in more Russian favorable dialogue when it comes to negotiations. Now I would like to talk briefly about the Ukrainian successes that we've seen so far. Keeping supplies incoming to Kiev and other besieged cities. Stores in Kiev, speaking with people that I know who are still in Kiev, are still stocked. Delivery trucks are still showing up and dropping off groceries. It depends on the area of the city that you're in, but it's remarkable to me when I was speaking with them about this, that the city's starting to become encircled, yet they're still finding ways to get food and basic needs and basic goods to the people who are staying there. We're also seeing Ukrainian successes in preventing misinformation and disinformation. And I know Professor Paar-Jakli is going to speak on this, so I'll just be brief. But one thing I will mention is that the security services of Ukraine are constantly providing cybersecurity tips and widespread caution about fakes or misinformation that's being disseminated to the public, and the public's being very receptive of it. People on the ground, average citizens, are very aware of the likelihood that Russian saboteurs or Russia itself are providing fake or misleading information. And so there are constant interactions between the public and the security services that are helping prevent the dissemination of misinformation. There's also continuous unity and resistance. I mentioned in the previous panel about the mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, and the former president Poroshenko and the current president Zelensky, who are all generally thought of as political opponents, seemingly united in unifying not just themselves, but their parties and their people, their followers, behind this effort to resist this tyrannical invasion of Ukrainian territory. And I think it's a really remarkable thing, and I would count it as a Ukrainian success story, to see this continued unity and resistance as the war is waged on. Whether it stays united as things get harder and harder remains to be seen, but the level of unity that I'm seeing still is very promising in terms of the continuity of such unity. And then finally, the wartime government's structure is very impressive. Ukraine's keeping its government structures functioning at a remarkable level. It's staying current on its international debts, which is something that Russia's not being able to do right now. And Russia's not a country that's invaded by a strong military aggressor. The Ukrainian government's been capable of informing the public, providing services, and supporting individual constituencies at any given time. I found it really interesting to see that some members of the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, are actively taking constituent concerns and addressing them, whether it be through Facebook or Telegram or some other social media. But they're also kind of keeping lines of communication with their constituencies open. And I think that that's a very important element to maintaining the level of unity, but also the level of resistance that's been so successful at preventing the Russian military invasion from achieving the successes that it otherwise might have.
Thank you, Dr. Kaul. And we can pick up your questions at the Q&A section. And so if you could quit sharing your screen. And next up, I would like to introduce Dr. Gabriella Paar-Jakli, who is an associate professor in political science.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. I wanted to thank everybody who came today and people who are listening, and my colleagues, as well as all the organizers. So thank you very much. I would like to just emphasize, along with my colleagues, that as we speak, we have seen the laws of war, just basic, minimal, minimal expectations being violated, that there were over 200 schools damaged or destroyed in Ukraine, over 30 hospitals damaged or destroyed, more than 1,500, in fact, it's in the thousands of residential buildings. So civilians being intentional targets is a humongous problem. And just today, a Russian airstrike destroyed a maternity and children's hospital in Mariupol. So it's just very devastating. And yes, we need to do all we can to strengthen Ukraine, sanction Russia, care for refugees, all of those things, think about energy dependence. But we also need to deter and think through how to respond to obviously nuclear war, but also cyber and other types of Russian escalation, and also put domestic pressure on Putin, Vladimir Putin. And as my colleagues mentioned, there is a lot of disinformation out there, and that is doing a lot of damage. So today I would like to address some of those questions that were asked during our last panel, but also review issues of global security as they relate to cybersecurity and specifically information warfare, influence operations, and disinformation campaigns that are happening and have been happening for many years. So here I would like to make the distinction between that some may not see as completely clear, the distinction between what's misinformation. Misinformation is just false information that one spreads because they believe it to be true. Disinformation, on the other hand, is false information that one spreads even though they know it to be false. So they are trying to deceive people. And it could be perceived as some sort of a weapon of mass destruction, in a sense, this and misinformation, using and abusing human gullibility and ignorance and things like that. The spread of this on social media, amplification and things of that nature are huge problems today. And as, again, my colleagues mentions, Ukrainians find out that relatives in Russia don't even believe there is a war, or they are threatened, or whatever is happening indeed. And that's perhaps because they listen to the many state-sponsored media such as RT or Sputnik or something else, either by choice or based on what's available to them. Russia is vast rural territory. And yes, there is resistance, but it's mostly in the big cities where people are protesting. as my colleague Dr. Barnes said, we even had one of our former students sending us a message on social media and elsewhere, basically about this idea that sane Russians, and I'm quoting, sane Russians are against this war, this horrendous war. It's Putin's war, not ours. We despise it. But those are the voices of people who are relatively well informed and mostly in the urban areas. So we don't know the extent of the resistance. And the problem is, and I'm going back to the questions that were asked last time. Some of the questions were related to the growth of authoritarianism in the region, specifically in Eastern Europe, and whether this war will have destabilizing effects on the region, including the European Union. Now we see that Facebook is blocked, Twitter is blocked in Russia, basically all social media. It's very difficult to see any other information other than state media. Radio Free Europe is down, BBC is down, over 200 companies or even more are out. So it's basically, you could say that even if we are not in the midst of World War III, fortunately, if we think about nuclear, the devastating effects of nuclear weapons, which we only have for deterrence purposes, we can't emphasize that enough. At least at the minimum, we are in some sort of a Cold War 2.0, and we have been, and people don't pay enough attention on an individual level, as well as even I'm, referencing at the leadership level, not enough. So there's this fear that a new Iron Curtain may be closing as Putin's invasion of Ukraine leaves Russia deeply isolated, both culturally and economically from the world. And so last week I mentioned that while those nation states that are members of both the European Union and especially if they have NATO membership, such as Poland, Hungary, my birth state, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, are a very different situation, or in a very different situation than Ukraine, they are safer because of that. Because of the NATO membership. So, however, the Kremlin's goal has been restoring Russia's historic sphere of influence, making Russia great again, that Dr. Kaul mentioned. And so this information warfare and actively discrediting the Western liberal democratic system has been ongoing. And we have seen that with Brexit, we have seen that with the 2016 presidential election, we have seen that at work with supporting far-right parties in Europe. But this warfare, this information warfare, is not as visible to a lot of people, at least. This is to shape the hearts and minds, online and offline. And yes, we have always had some sort of thing called propaganda, but this is amplified to the point that people question the interpretation of reality. It divides communities in democratic nations, undermines the political system from within and from the outside as well. We live in a world in which virality trumps veracity in online warfare. So what the Kremlin has been doing, and I referenced that last time a little bit, is they use this two-track method, mostly specifically in Central and Eastern Europe, and then they apply that in the West as well, this tailor-made two-track method of trying to economically capture nation states, other states, within this cyber warfare, manipulate countries by dominating strategic sectors, sectors of their economy to abuse capitalistic methods and exploit the weakness in the economic governance system, target the energy sector, media sector, infrastructure, financial sector, and things like that. And we have seen increased economic activity especially in Europe and elsewhere. The other thing is political capture, to corrode democracy from within by deepening political divides and cultivating relationships with aspiring autocrats, political parties, populists, and so on. So cyber propaganda, and that's part of this new generation warfare. Now, there was a question last time, did anyone expect the role that social media would play in this conflict? Yes, it was expected. At least it was if we paid any attention. In fact, there's a lot of new research on the weaponization of social media. Some scholars call it like war, hashtag like war, the information war to shape, again, the hearts and minds of people. And as Dr. Kaul mentioned, in this regard, we have a little bit of good news that Ukraine is winning, in a sense that it's important what they are putting out there and trying to do a lot of what's called not just debunking false information, but also using the methodology of pre-bunking, so to speak. So in order to understand that, what those mean, in modern war and politics, this information space that I'm talking about is one of the most crucial parts of the battle. If your ideas get out and win out, that determines pretty much everything from whether soldiers and voters join your cause to what they believe about the very truth around the world around them. But if your ideas don't win, you may lose. So Vladimir Putin knows this very well. Russia's information warriors ran wild for years, hacking democracies by intervening in over 30 national elections. They elevated conspiracy theories from the range of, QAnon to coronavirus vaccine lies, as well as provided justification, as Dr. Barnes mentioned, for, the war in Georgia, had a role in Syrian war and things like that. So going back for a second to Ukraine, winning the hearts and minds in information warfare, hopefully, they are turning the tables on Russia in this sense. So in the 2014 attack on Ukraine that came before this current war, Russia pushed out made-up stories about various atrocities, such as Ukrainian soldiers crucifying a 3-year-old boy. Big lies, driven viral, stoking anger, because these use emotions. This time, Russia's adversaries did not just try to debunk claims, but also pre-bunk. And there's a network. We're all in this. It's administrations of our own, other Western nation states, other democracies. This network was bolstered by a broad all-night coalition of democracy activists and OSINT, or the short for open source intelligence trackers, who also weighed in to preempt and pre-bunk Russian lies. One of the most interesting ones was that there was a part of directly debunking various planned Russian provocation in the last days and hours leading up to the invasion. For example, there were online activists who took pictures of the wristwatches of Russian leaders that showed that Putin's supposed emergency meetings were actually pre-taped, while in turn Ukrainian military announced that Russia was about to blow up certain buildings, blame it on them, before Russia actually could destroy the buildings. So debunking, pre-bunking, these are very important. So we don't know what the future holds. I'm trying to wrap up what I have to say. Of course, I've been going on and on. I just wanted to say one more thing on the responsibility of social media companies that will play a huge role in the future. They have to rethink how to operate in democracies versus totalitarian states. We don't want to close the free information space, because that could be detrimental. It's already closing in Russia. We need to find other ways to get information into Russia, because they need it really badly. But also at the same time, pay attention to what's happening in this realm, how companies react. Facebook, for example, did a lot in regards to trying to demonetize, getting rid of the advertising possibility of Russian state media on Facebook. And Twitter also did a lot of this, what's called downranking and demoting certain state media outlets that actually reduced 80% of the amplification of false disinformation and misinformation and things like that. So as I said, trying to close my section, I'm just drawing attention to the idea that we are living through times when there's a generation growing up who doesn't remember Cold War 1.0. And that's a good thing. But at the same time, if we want to have the appropriate response, we have to pay attention and learn from history, because otherwise we are making the same mistakes and giving in to the demands of an authoritarian, and there's no end in sight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you provided a very wonderful segue there to our last discussant, who is Dr. Richard Steigmann-Gall, a professor of history. And last time we started with history, This week, we're going to conclude with history. And before you get started, Richard, I would like to just remind our attendees that we are leaving time for your questions. And so if you want to begin to, put your questions in the Q&A, we can begin to answer those after Richard's presentation. So thank you, Richard.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. And Gabriella, I learned a new word that you just mentioned, pre-bunk. I've added a new word to my vocabulary. I've never heard the expression pre-bunk before, so that's excellent. I'll try to find opportunities to use it myself. So yeah, several strands that will connect what Gabriella and I had to say. And Molly, I may not be quite the historian I was last week because I want to actually bring this up to current events. Of course, everyone here on the panel, and we assume participants, are squarely opposed to what Putin has done with his invasion of Ukraine. What I want to do with my time as a scholar of the radical right and fascism, I find an opportunity for us to discuss something perhaps less, that gives us a pause for concern, put it that way. And that is the fact that there are many people in the United States who in the last couple of weeks have looked at what Putin has done in Ukraine and have expressed a positive response. They like it. And of course, this brings us to the question of Putin's role in American politics today, which is, of course, something of a hot iron to pick up. So let me do a share. Hope this works. When we look at the question of Putin in American politics today, of course, those of us who've been paying attention to American politics the last 5 or 6 years have confronted the question, was Trump Putin's puppet, right? This is a very long endured question now. People might remember about a week and a half before the 2016 presidential election, Secretary of State Clinton visited Kent State University, visited this campus to declare her belief that Putin was a puppet. It wasn't the first time she had made such a proclamation, but perhaps it was her strongest speech to that effect in the campaign up to that point. So the question of Trump having been a Manchurian president, if you like, to borrow a phrase from the famous 50s Hollywood film, The Manchurian Candidate, is very familiar to, I think, everybody here today. And of course, as Gabriella pointed out, the manipulation of social media is what we heard a great deal about. The introduction of fake news spread by bots, especially on Facebook, but other platforms as well, not the least of them Twitter, are the kinds of things that we're familiar with. And what is the takeaway of much of this debate that people had with themselves over these many years is how did Putin impact the electoral system, right, in the United States? Was Putin's malignant influence or his manipulation of social media platforms decisive in the outcome of that election? And so you get questions about how many really American voters, how many voters in this country actually changed their minds through the use of such tactics. If we accept, as I think most of my colleagues in political science and other departments would, that the vast majority of his voters would still have voted for Trump even without these manipulations, then that brings us to the question, really a different sort of question, I'll suggest, of the role of Putin in US politics. Now, of course, for those of you who kept in mind the activities of the last administration, some of you will recall having heard how it was that President Trump would frequently have visits to the Oval Office with only Russian officials, officials working for Vladimir Putin. Here, for instance, is his foreign minister, where no US officials were present in the room. Right? He actually kicked out anyone representing the US government besides himself so he could have conversations with Russian officials, where it was not too long thereafter revealed the president had provided state secrets to the Russian government. So when people ask themselves, how could it be that we don't have any intel assets on the ground, we must confront the likelihood that the under the Trump administration, such assets were sold or given freely to Vladimir Putin. So the larger question, though, that I really want to tackle, which is an even more perhaps delicate one, is not so much the question of manipulation of the American electoral system, but the question of how, in fact, it is, it's a much more dire topic, really, how it is that Vladimir Putin became an actual hero to many in the United States, and even as many politicians in US Congress who had previously expressed esteem for Putin are now changing their tune. In the last couple of weeks, we still have many people in the American political ecosystem who regard Putin, even after the invasion of Ukraine, as somebody to feel very positively about. One can cite, for instance, some pretty obvious examples. For instance, Steve Bannon, notorious white nationalist journalist who served in the Trump White House for many months, has expressed admiration for Putin just recently for being, quote unquote, anti-woke. And this earns Bannon's esteem. There are other personalities who we are hearing about lately, most especially Wendy Rogers of Arizona, who went to an AFPAC meeting this year led by one Nick Fuentes. And you see I've highlighted from this Washington Post article the particularly pungent passage at this year's AFPAC. Fuentes said that his group's, quote, secret ingredient was, quote unquote, young white men. He meant a particular type, I suspect. The article goes on, he led the crowd in a cheer for Russian President Vladimir Putin days into the deadly military assault on Ukraine. Fuentes noted Putin has been compared to Adolf Hitler. Those of you who were here last week saw that Time magazine cover that I used at the beginning of my presentation. They say that's not a good thing, he said, adding with a chuckle, I shouldn't have said that, right? So this classic LOL moment that many on the far right articulate as they are in fact expressing admiration. So friends, what are we getting at here? Whether it's QAnon, Oath Keepers, the alt-right more broadly, and we must address this as well, again, with considerable delicacy, some in the evangelical community in the United States who have decided that Putin is in fact a savior. Headlines such as this, why Putin is an ally for American evangelicals, from a scholar of American social and religious history at George Washington University. Here we have a Newsweek article, the Christian right is looking to Putin's Russia to save Christianity from the godless West. So this kind of ecosystem that we find ourselves confronting, and again, it's important to keep in mind, we must treat this question delicately. It would be entirely wrong, of course, to say that Christians as such in the United States are somehow all in favor of Putin, especially with his invasion now. I think the majority are looking squarely at him in a very negative light, but it's important to look at the question of ideological affinity, especially after the 2008 election, which permit me to suggest proved pivotal, as our first African-American president almost immediately came under attack by a conspiracy or a mythology that all of us will likely remember, called the birther myth, right? Which suggested that President Obama, in spite of appearing to us all to be a president born in the United States of the Christian faith, was in fact, according to this conspiracy theory, covertly a Muslim born in Kenya, and therefore the wrongful occupant of the White House. Now, against Obama, many people in this ecosystem that I've described, again, alt-right, Oath Keepers, QAnon, have viewed Putin as the antithesis. So he was positioned as everything Obama allegedly wasn't, not just Christian and white, but aggressively masculine. I'll spare our audience the classic images that we've all seen in great abundance of Vladimir Putin topless on horseback, galloping through rivers to demonstrate his manly virtue. But also somebody, it must be pointed out, who is, in their view, not afraid to fight the enemies of Western civilization, right? globalist forces that, in the view of many people on the American right and far right, are endangering Western civilization. Let us remind ourselves of some of the things that some of these people have had to say about Putin. Again, here, this is an article from The Guardian, and I'm happy to share links in the chat for those who want to read these articles for themselves. This is a Guardian article from just a couple of days ago that reminds us, quote, in 2004, David Duke, a longtime leader of the Ku Klux Klan, described Russia as, quote, key to white survival. In 2017, Ann Coulter, a right-wing author and commentator, opined, quote, in 20 years, Russia will be the only country that is recognizably European, end quote. What is her clear implication here? That immigration and the presence of Muslims and others from scenes of war, not least Syria, as others have talked about on this panel today, will dilute European cultural identity, and people like Ann Coulter look to Putin to retain an inherently white, inherently Christian identity that they feel is intrinsic, not just to Europe, but to the West itself. So when you look at what it is that American members of the far right, and perhaps even, sorry to say, not such a far right, like about Putin, it is, of course, his attack on the LGBTQ community, Muslims, and what are perceived to be the godless more broadly, whatever that might mean, depends from one case to the next. Immigrants, both societies, Russia and the United States, the xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment oftentimes leads to an admiration of Putin, and more broadly, globalists who are perceived to be behind the forces that are undermining what is perceived to be a proper West. Now, with the say-so of our hosts today, I have lined up a video, 51-second video that I've seen on Twitter. I'm not sure if this will be audible to others here. Let me know if it cannot be heard, and I will see what I can do. But I want to say this should work. This is, as this particular tweet explains, this is a person on the right named Lauren Witzke, who ran as candidate for the Senate in the Delaware GOP in 2020, who has quite a bit to say here. Let me see if we can hear it. And if not, I'll leave it in the link. I'll leave it as a link for others to listen to. Let me tell me, please, if you can hear this or not.
Actually, Richard, if you want to just put it in the link, because we're at time.
Okay, all right. You don't want me to play this video then?
Yes, we're a little bit past time, and we only have 10 minutes now for questions.
Okay, sure thing.
Thank you.
I make it as brief as I could. Anyway, let me end my share. And I will go ahead and put it as a link in the chat. And so I'll just conclude by saying we're looking, I'm afraid, at a broader ideological syndrome within American domestic politics that it seems won't go away anytime soon. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, and definitely please put those articles in the chat for our attendees to be able to more thoroughly look at them, and I know I want to as well. And so again, I want to remind participants, if you would like to add into the Q&A any questions that you have. And we do have a question that was raised about the Budapest memorandum on security assurances. And so I don't know, Dr. Cooper, if that's your wheelhouse. You're muted, Neil.
Yes, kind of. I think it's worth making a couple of points about the Budapest memorandum. It came up last week. And just to note the context here for the memorandum is that, and I think this is really significant, that the end of the Cold War, Ukraine inherited a large nuclear arsenal after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It inherited 1,900 nuclear warheads, 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and 44 strategic bombers. This made it the third largest nuclear weapons holding country in the world after the US and Russia, right? So it suddenly kind of, inherited all these nuclear weapons. By 1996, all those nuclear munitions had been transferred to the Soviet Union for dismantlement. So Ukraine voluntarily, with a little element of coercion and incentives and stuff, transferred all these weapons and gave them up. Heartily encouraged by US administrations, the US policy really in the aftermath of the Cold War was that Russia should be the only country that should succeed the Soviet Union as a nuclear state. And indeed, the US refused to provide security assurances to Ukraine until it had ratified key nuclear arms control agreements. This is with including the START agreement, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the 1992 Lisbon Protocol, which committed Ukraine to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. The upshot of all this was the Ukrainians, for obvious reasons, were concerned about this, reluctance to do it without security guarantees. The upshot of all these discussions was the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which was headlined security assurances. So they were not guarantees, they were kind of lower level of security assurances. It was a political agreement rather than a legal agreement. And in the agreement, the US, Russia, and Britain committed to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine, and to refrain from the threats or use of force against the country. During the negotiations, it was suggested that the US had indicated to the Ukrainians that in the event of Russian violations, the US would take a strong interest and respond, but that wasn't in the agreement. In the agreement itself as well, the US, Russia, and the UK commit to seek immediate UN Security Council action to provide assistance to the Ukraine as a non-nuclear weapon state party to the treaty on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons if Ukraine should become a victim of an act of aggression. In 2014, when Russia annexed the Crimea, both the US and the UK described it as a breach of the Budapest memorandum. Needless to say, the Russian rationale for the reason why it was not is because Ukrainian democracy meant that the new government was not legitimate in the eyes of Russia, and so that the agreement did not apply. I think the issues around this are quite significant for questions about nuclear disarmament going forward, when we think about Iran, when we think about North Korea, when we think about whether states would sign up to the 2017 treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And the issue is clearly, Ukraine was persuaded, encouraged to give up its nuclear weapons in return for these security assurances, albeit that they were not guarantees and that this was not a legally binding agreement. So I think there's a kind of question of the fact that what has happened in the aftermath of this agreement, and it's clear that Russia has violated it. There are questions around whether the US and the UK have done enough to adhere to their commitments, but more broadly, I think it raises the history here, raises big questions for the willingness of other states to pursue this path.
Thank you very much. And we have a question from the audience, which is, I think, for our Russian and Putin experts, which is, do we have any idea of Putin's view of nuclear war? Do we know if he fears it as an existential threat to the world, or just as a more destructive and widespread form of warfare that Russia could survive and persevere through?
I'll take a stab at this. It's a difficult question because we don't know what Putin is thinking. Having observed him over the past 20 some years, but also studied a little bit of his history and his background, you know, I think that a lot of people are making this comparison to, you know, the nihilistic approach of Hitler in the bunker at the as Berlin was falling. And the question, I think, is trying to get at whether or not Putin will or perceives nuclear war as an option. I don't think, to quickly answer the one part of that question, I don't think he's under or the misperception or misguided enough to think that a nuclear war with NATO and the United States would not result in total destruction, or nor do I believe he thinks that Russia could survive and persevere through such a war. I think that he likely has an understanding of the perils of it, and I think what we're seeing from him is the saber rattling to try and use that threat of nuclear war to scare diplomatic opponents as well as military opponents into behaving in a way that he would prefer them to behave. And just one other thing that I had in my follow-up questions was about why are we hearing about the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in Chernobyl? A large number of my contacts are telling me that there's this perception on the part of, or there's this attempt on the part of the Russian military to make a flawed and fake news kind of misappropriation that Ukraine would use a dirty bomb or utilize that nuclear material. And so they're strategically trying to acquire these and control these facilities in order to prevent that from happening. And so I think that if Putin does actually, just the fact that he's focusing on Chernobyl and Zaporizhia is maybe evident that he is concerned with the threat of nuclear war or the threat of things going south and creating another nuclear disaster.
Andrew, you're muted, Andrew.
Yep. A little slow on that, sorry. Eli and I have talked about this a lot, and so I agree with everything he said. The only bit I would add is that the decision to launch a nuclear weapon is never just one person's. And so we're fortunate in that, so that not only it seems that Putin doesn't want to blow up the whole world, but even if he did, it seems likely that sort of the next folks who would have to agree with him to launch the weapons might not, right? Many of them have families, they have children, they expect the world to go on. And so that should give us at least some comfort. It's too bad that that's kind of what you have to rely on, but there's some evidence that that's the case right now.
Okay, and I know we're a little bit over time, but there is one other question that was raised that I hope we can answer, and it's to what degree should the West supply Ukraine with weapons that will be used, and at what point should NATO use force to protect Ukraine? Neil, you're muted.
I mean, on the last question, obviously, you know, my presentation indicated the kind of risks of using force, right? And you know, the consequences of entering into World War III. One of the questions that I do wonder about is whether, you know, there would be a value in issuing red lines about the use of particular kinds of weapons, right? That whether it's a red line over chemical weapons or, you know, a red line over the use of nuclear weapons, right? And if, for instance, Russia used you know, nuclear weapons in Ukraine, you could kind of think, well, that's the point at which we're in World War III anyway. So now the history of kind of, American red lines, particularly with regards to chemical weapons use, is not great. One thinks back to Syria, for instance. I think there was a better example in the Gulf War in 1991, where they were arguably reasonably effective. But I think that for me is a question mark. Should there be some kind of red line over, the kinds of weapons that Russia uses, and that would maybe send some kind of signal about limiting the war in some way.
Andrew?
Yeah. So the answer to the questions are at some level moral or sort of individual. But if you want to take it outside of that to some extent, you ask what it is you're trying to achieve and what are the costs of doing so, and what are the costs of doing nothing, which is always important to remember, right? You're either doing something or you're doing nothing, and both of them are choices. So if the goal is to end the war, which to me, I think practically means getting Russia to withdraw, because I don't think Ukraine will stop fighting as long as Russia is still present as a military force, then you have to ask how you can do that. One way to facilitate that is to ship weapons to the war zone. And I expect that will continue and probably increase. I've been a little surprised at the hesitancy to ship aircraft. The idea that there's a qualitative difference from that and anti-aircraft guns it's splitting a hair. All of these are political decisions, but so that's what's going on. It wouldn't surprise me to see aircraft eventually delivered. Probably not a ton, because they would have to be old Soviet aircraft, because that's what the Ukrainians can fly. In terms of the no-fly zone, I suspect that's the next area where we'll continue to talk about potential conflict with Russia. The choice being, you can cower out of the fear. I'm sorry to use the word cower, that sounds prejudicial. You can be concerned that Russia will launch a nuclear weapon if you cross some sort of line. An alternative is to follow on what Neil was talking about, which is to tell Russia that, fine, if you launch a nuclear weapon, we'll launch 3 or something like that. Right? Let's be clear, we're not just going to let you dictate to us because you have a lot of nuclear weapons. The hope, of course, is that nobody fires any of them, but that will take probably at the very least increasingly hot rhetoric and direct rhetoric, and probably my expectation is it will take at least the continuation of supplying of materiel and perhaps the imposition of some sort of restriction on flight in Western Ukraine.
Thank you. And Eli, you'd like to make another point?
I just want to add that, so in regards to the no-fly zone approach, I think one thing that it's very important to note is that NATO forces have been providing air support to the bordering area, so the NATO member states surrounding the western flank of Ukraine. And this is largely the extent to which they can do that without provoking Russia to respond. But the other concern is the Russian anti-aircraft capabilities. And so one of the other aspects of imposing a NATO no-fly zone would be the vulnerability that we're sending our pilots to be subject to those anti-aircraft capabilities. And I think that that's one thing that, that's the moral decision that has to be made. Are we willing to sacrifice blood and treasure, or just treasure? And so that's the question that's being asked at the moment. And at the moment, Neil's presentation at the beginning was very poignant, and I think that it is something that we have to consider. I know I'm personally invested in Ukraine tremendously, and I don't want to see what's going on happen, but I also understand the broader implications of engaging in armed combat with Russia directly. And so I think that's something that the United States is being and has been very astute about in its approach. And we have been supplying weapons constantly for the last 8 years except for one brief little pause where President Trump wasn't happy with President Zelensky and withheld the military support and financial aid. The United States has been taking active measures in preparation for such an invasion. And I think that the intelligence that President Biden has been releasing prior to the invasion demonstrates the amount of commitment and kind of the extent to which the commitment that the United States is willing to go as the war moves on. Now, as the Russian invaders begin to take more and more harsh actions, we can expect the United States response to escalate in conjunction with that, whether that involves escalating to the level of on the ground or in the air military confrontation, or the potential for such remains to be seen.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Neil, you wanted to make another point? You're muted.
Yes, just very quickly to say, I think one of the risks here, and I think one of the calculations of the Russians, is that over time, Western attention begins to wane. And that if the Russians can create, relatively quickly create a kind of like set of facts on the ground, and those facts become the new status quo, that the kind of the levels of media attention that we've seen, the level of popular attention, the levels of diplomatic attention begin to kind of fade and wane, and the discussions about needing to do constructive engagement and worry about the economics and the broader power issues, etc., they begin to kick in. So whilst at the moment it looks like everybody's lined up against Putin and Russia, I think the big question is, where will we be in 2 months' time, or 6 months' time, or 12 months' time? And that, I think, is much more of an open question.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think that's a really good point to end on, is that, we are looking, specifically at this incursion, but there are bigger issues that we also should be considering as we think through our understandings of this. And I wish that you could be hearing audience applause, and I also want to applaud our audience for returning for a part 2, asking some really insightful questions and staying with us. And so on behalf of our audience, I do want to thank all of our discussants. I'm continually humbled and honored to work with such brilliant colleagues. Sandra.
Thank you, Molly. This was a fascinating conversation, and I am really grateful for all of you for all of the information that you provided. Everyone has given us quite a lot of food for thought, I think, and I have my notes and my references that I'll be looking up later today. I would like to remind the audience that we will do this again. We'll have a three-peat. So scheduled for next Wednesday, March 16th, same time, 5 p.m. till 6:30, we will present part 3 of Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the next time we will talk about the human cost of war more broadly, and the human cost of the invasion in Ukraine very specifically. This will be in collaboration with the University of Akron, where we will invite a couple of other experts to join the panel to share their insights and their expertise with us. And there may be other guests as well. And then we will take a short hiatus because of spring break, and we'll be back. This, I think, will be a long-term and very interesting conversation. And there are many, many aspects of this invasion and the geopolitical complications that are a result of it that we'll be able to discuss. So back to you, Molly, for final comments, but I did want to make sure that our audience knew that this will be a continuing conversation starting next Wednesday from 5 until 6:30, once again via Zoom. Thanks.
I'm going to let you have the final word. That I think is the best note to end on. That this will be a sustained conversation, and the College of Arts and Sciences is heavily involved with collaborations as well as looking at our own talents to continue to engage in these important discussions.
Well, on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, I'd like to say that we're firmly committed to these types of conversations and sharing of information, not only within the Kent State University community, but with the community at large. And we look forward to continuing to be supportive of your efforts and others. And we will look for multiple ways to engage with our audiences, not only through Zoom, and face-to-face panel conversations, but other ways that we can engage as well. So, on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, the departments of Political Science and History, and the School of Peace and Conflict Studies, along with the School of Multidisciplinary Social Sciences and Humanities, we thank you all for participating and look forward to seeing you next week. That ends our program, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. And thank you all to the discussants and to you, Molly, for being such a great moderator. Thanks again.